Hello, my name is Marcus Chavez and I'm with IFARA TV. Today we will be cablecasting segments of the press conferences that were held during the 22nd CROI, which is the annual conference on retroviruses and opportunistic infections, which took place in Seattle, Washington this year. This segment will be presented by Helen Rees, who is with the WHO, which is based in Geneva, Switzerland. Helen Rees is also the founder and executive director of the WITS Reproductive Health and HIV Institute in Johannesburg, South Africa. Helen talks about the results of the FACTS trial. The FACTS trial is a randomized placebo-controlled trial that looks at the use and effectiveness of tenofovir as a microbicide to protect against HIV.
Thank you. So following the results of the CAPRISA 004 study in 2010, this was a phase 2b study that evaluated the effectiveness of tenofovir gel in protecting women against HIV infection. That showed a 39% effectiveness, but this was a relatively small study with the results coming from 2 clinical trial sites. So it was understood that we would need to do a phase 3 trial, repeating the same regimen, which was using gel within 12 hours before and within 12 hours after sex, and no more than 2 gels in 24 hours, to see whether in fact we could replicate these findings in a broader population. So the FACTS 001 study was undertaken in 9 sites across South Africa, and it was a phase 3 randomized controlled trial, placebo-controlled trial, to evaluate the effectiveness of tenofovir gel in preventing both HIV-1 as the primary endpoint, but also herpes as a secondary endpoint. So in all, we enrolled 2,059 women. It was a very well-conducted study, but the analysis unfortunately showed no difference finally in the outcome between the tenofovir gel arm and the placebo arm. And this obviously was a disappointment. And so we tried to explore why that should have been. Was it that the women did not use the product, which is one of the challenges we've seen in these trials historically? Was it that the product wasn't effective, or was it a combination of both? In order to understand that, we had 2 measures of adherence. The first was based on talking to the women and getting them to return their applicators, and we developed a formula to see how well those sexual acts had been protected. And in the study, we found on average that women had protected their sex acts between 50 to 60% of the time, according to the protocol, i.e. using 2 gels. We were interested knowing what the results were from the other studies about high adherence being possibly protected. So we were interested in looking at the high adherers in our study. But using that same formula, we found that only 13% of the women were able to use the gel more than 80% of the time. So that means that a small number get this high level of adherence. Most of the women tried to use it 50 to 60% of the time reported, but that clearly wasn't enough. To look at this in a different way, we looked at tenofovir levels, and these were collected on a quarterly basis through lavage, vaginal lavage. And we had a sub-study, which was a random sample of about 214 women, where we looked at all of these tenofovir levels. We said, did they have tenofovir present, yes or no, and how did that correlate to HIV infection? Now, in that group, we found that 22% of the women had tenofovir in all of their samples. About 65% had it in some of their samples, and only 13% had it in none of their samples. And what that tells us is that in this group, it was a sub-study, 87% of the women altogether tried to use this product. They tried, but they couldn't use it. When we looked further and we looked at tenofovir and HIV incidence, in one analysis we found that in women who had tenofovir present and had had sex in the previous 10 days, that they had about 52% protection in that group compared to women who didn't have tenofovir present, indicating again that women who are high adherers are probably going to get some protection, but you have to be right up there with adherence, probably over 80% of the time. So our conclusion was that in this general population, using the gel like this didn't work, but in a subpopulation, if we look at the tenofovir levels, there's an indication that this product probably does work, but you have to use it consistently and correctly to a very high level, which is a challenge for most of the women. We should mention that in this cohort, it was the youngest cohort of women ever in a trial of this nature. The average age was 23 years. Most of them were single, and many of them lived at home with parents. It's really important for us to think about this. We're going to have a big social science analysis of this study, but we have to get our heads around the lives of these women. They tried to use this gel, they couldn't use it, and mostly they couldn't use it because their life conditions just mitigated against it. They don't have sex at home, they're single, they have different sorts of partners. It is extremely difficult. We need new technologies that are going to fit into these women's lives. And it's not just long-acting. We still need pericoital technologies for many of these women, but they need to be much more forgiving, I think, than we found the tenofovir gel is. It just, even 50 to 60% isn't enough to crack that nut. But we have to think differently about this group of young women.
Thanks.